Hello, Kate here from the Narrate team. This Easter weekend, we start a brand new message series entitled Seriously. Adam starts us off by asking, is the resurrection historically reliable? He explores the historical support for the resurrection and its importance to our understanding of who Jesus claimed to be and what he claimed to have accomplished.
Hi guys. Hi. How you doing? Happy Easter. It's great to see you. In case you're wondering, I did not wet myself. I spilt water on my lap just before I got up here, so lest you be distracted, we're okay, so just cover that now. So if you were with us last year, you may remember that we had a man with a iconic beard and a priestly outfit and a goat and some screaming goats on the video, and we talked about the significance of the Day of Atonement and how Jesus lumped all that into what he accomplished on Easter Sunday. This morning, we couldn't figure out what to do with the high priest, and we thought it'd be a little awkward to just have him stand there without anything for him to do, so we put him behind the base. You may have picked up on that. Really, this morning, what I want to accomplish is, as much as I was excited last year to talk about Jewish history and the atonement and how all that fits together, this morning, what I want to get after is there good reason to believe in the resurrection? And by good reason, I mean, is there anything historical by way of historical evidence, or is just this kind of myth and legend, and anybody could have kind of hidden a body and thrown something into the river or something along those lines and made some of those things happen? So we're going to delve deep into the historicity this morning. It's kicking off a series called Seriously, and just talking about the resurrection and did it matter, and if so, why did it matter, and is there really good reason to believe that it happened? But first, we need to talk about the attempted murder case against one James Dixon. James Dixon, about a decade ago or so, probably longer than that now, was arrested for attempted homicide. And in the prosecuting stages of things, as they were putting together the case, they had everything that a good attorney would need. They had a weapon, they had fingerprints, they had witnesses, they had a wounded police officer, Sergeant Scanlon, who'd been shot in the abdomen. They had it all. In fact, in the end, they even had a confession. See, what happened was one afternoon, Sergeant Scanlon was doing his route on Chicago's south side, and it was then that he got a call from dispatch, and dispatch said there was an incident in a nearby neighborhood, asked him to please go deal with it. He knew pulling into it that it was a domestic kind of issue, that he's told there was a man with a handgun who was very angry with his girlfriend, and they were arguing on the front lawn. And about the time his squad car pulled up to the house, it was then that the girlfriend's father finally had the gumption to go defend her. Something about the police officer's presence is what gave him the courage to leave the house. No commentary there, right? And so he came barreling out of the house before the police officer could really do anything and got in a tussle with James Dixon. And it was in the midst of that tussle that Sergeant Scanlon, his first act of duty happened. He had to get inside of it and try to break it up. And as he was in the close proximity of trying to break up that little tussle was when a gunshot was heard, and Sergeant Scanlon kind of staggered away from the incident, bleeding from the abdomen. By that time, other officers had already arrived. They were kind of dealing with the issue. They arrested James Dixon, I guess is what I mean by dealing with it, threw him in a squad car. They then found a handgun, a .22 caliber handgun that Dixon had been carrying in a nearby bush. As they prosecuted the case, they learned that the handgun was covered with his fingerprints, that it was registered to his name, that the father didn't even own a gun, let alone he wasn't armed during the incident, that Officer Scanlon's gun was still in his holster. It just seemed like a signed and sealed deal. And again, on top of all that, they had a confession. A man with a history of violence saying, I did it. But that's when it got interesting. See, in the end, what happened was he took a plea agreement and the gavel rang down, sentenced him to a limited time in prison. And the reporter who covered the case worked for the Chicago Tribune. And it was a couple days later that his phone rang. And that's when things started to unwind a bit. At the other end of the line, he quickly recognized the voice of a familiar informant. The informant said, hey, do you know about the James Dixon case? And he said, yeah, it was a slam dunk case. I covered it a couple days ago. What else do you got? The informant said, not so fast. What do you mean not so fast? He said, well, word on the street is that just a few weeks prior to the incident, Sergeant Scanlon was at a party, and after a few adult beverages, started bragging about the fact that he had recently acquired a pen gun. What's a pen gun, he was asked. The informant went on to explain to him that a pen gun is a .22 caliber pistol, essentially, that's manufactured to look like a fountain pen. One carries it in their shirt with their pocket protector next to their ruler and things of that sort, and the pen with the multicolors on it. And the idea is you can't tell it's a gun. They're illegal, the informant told him, and they're especially illegal for police officers to carry while on duty. To which the reporter said, well, what's your point? And he said, well, what they're starting to think, what some think, is that Sergeant Scanlon shot himself with his own pen gun, and in the incident of James Dixon, there was enough coincidence involved that they were able to frame him. He's taken the fall. The reporter wasn't amused. He was skeptical. He picked up the phone, and after calling a couple people, one trusted person, he learned that, in fact, a grand jury was being formed, that there was enough evidence to maybe turn the facts in a little bit different direction, and so he made a few more calls, and this reporter began to do a little more investigating. He learned that there was a witness who claimed that there was a gunshot fired long before the police officer ever arrived at the incident. Where was it fired, he asked him. He said, well, when it was fired, James Dixon was still arguing with his girlfriend through the screen door. A little bit of research revealed that there was evidence of a .22 caliber shot being fired downward into the concrete stairs at the front house. So yeah, there was one bullet missing from the chamber of James Dixon's gun, but that could have been the bullet. They also learned that Sergeant Scanlon, the inside of his pocket, had evidence from gunpowder, the type of evidence that you would expect from a close shot, and that the exit hole of the bullet was in a downward direction. In fact, the wound in the officer's abdomen was in a downward direction. Finally, the reporter asked James Dixon, like, man, what is going on here? It sure seems like there's enough evidence to say you're innocent and you're being framed. If that's the case, why would you have pled guilty? And in the process of the grand jury and all that came with it, James Dixon ultimately said, well, when the plea agreement was offered, I'd already served 8 months in jail. They offered me a plea deal of 12 months, 1 year in jail. By the time I actually signed the dotted line and the judge's gavel rang down, I had served 362 days in jail. They told me that if I went to trial and was found guilty of shooting a police officer in the abdomen, I'd get the maximum sentence somewhere around 20 years. Now, in the end, Sergeant Scanlon was convicted of carrying illegally a gun that, in fact, wounded him on his own volition. James Dixon was exonerated. And that whole thing, it raises this question, and this is really the idea that I want to get you thinking about this morning. It's simply this. Have you noticed that there's evidence, and then there's what you want the evidence to say, and then there's a tension? And we see this in marriage, and we see this in science, and we see this in journeys of faith, that there's the facts, if you will. And then there's your interpretation of the facts. There's what you emotionally need those facts to say. There's how you arrange them. And then there's your opinion. Or if you prefer, there's faith. Listen, it's Easter Sunday, and it's not lost on any of us what we're here for and why what I'm supposed to talk about. Sometimes, as much as I celebrate the resurrection, it's why I like July 14th more, because there's less of an expectation. Just being honest. But I guess what I would like to say first and foremost is, listen, some of you are here not because of what you believe, but because of what he believes or she believes, or what you used to believe, or what your parents want you to believe, or what you wish you could still believe. And we embrace that with you. And I guess if nothing else, the thought process I'd love to get turning in your head is, what are the facts as you understand them, and what do you need them to say? And how has that formed faith for you? And what if faith isn't something that Christians or Christ followers or religious people have? What if it's something we all have? That if we're honest, we can't even really prove that Julius Caesar existed. Like, in the end, there's facts, and there's how we arrange them, and there's a tension. Some of you are here and you're wavering in your faith. Maybe you really believe in the community who matters locally. Maybe you really believe even in emotional health and growth and the things that come with that. But if we were to be honest, and maybe you've not even said this to anybody, your faith in historic Orthodox, if that's what you want to call it, Christianity, you're kind of, it's getting a little sketchy. You're like a boxer in the 7th round that's just one good gut punch away from going down permanently. One more scandal, one more late night discovery, one more friend that does one thing and says another, one more incident like that, and it's over. And I guess this morning, I don't have this big emotional aha for you. I have just this observation that I would love for you to wrestle with is what do you need the facts to say? And ultimately, what if there is good evidence for the historicity of the resurrection? Some of you are here and you're new to faith. Some of you are not new to faith, but your faith isn't wavering. And I guess the win for me, for you this morning, is to begin to understand that what if you believe in more than cult religion? Like, what if you believe in more than ideas that somebody made up and some people believe? What if there's history? Not that you can prove it, because let's be honest, we can't prove much that happened back behind us. But nonetheless, there's some logic to it. See, the reality is almost nobody questions that there was a guy named Jesus who lived in Nazareth, who lived some 2,000 years ago. It would be a scarce historian that questions the historical existence of a man named Jesus who accomplished many of the things the scriptures tell us. It would be somewhat naive because his imprint upon world history is almost entirely undeniable. Further still, almost no one questions that he was crucified by the Romans. But the question really is, did he die in the midst of that crucifixion? And if he did die in the midst of it, was the tomb really empty? And if the tomb really was empty, did he really appear bodily to people after it was all over? But see, before there was a crucifixion, there was a flogging. Because that's what comes with crucifixion, almost every time. And before there was a flogging, there was a garden. And then there was a garden, there was a God who deals with many of the emotional things you deal with. Listen to Jesus as he just unpacks, does the author Luke, a little bit of Jesus' emotional state on the eve of what he's about to experience. Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. On reaching the place, he said to them, "Pray that you will not fall into temptation." He withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, knelt down and prayed, "Father, hey, Dad, if you're willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." An angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him, and being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. Now, as we ask the question, is there historical evidence for this? It starts there, because that seems a little fantastic, doesn't it? A little emotional, a little like, woo. But in fact, that whole incident of bleeding, of sweating blood, it's a medical condition, a rare one, but it's called hemodosis. Hemodosis is this rare condition brought on by intense psychological stress. It seems Jesus knew what was coming his direction. He wasn't the first guy to be crucified. He wasn't naive to what it involved. Hemodosis involves incredible anxiety that breaks down the capillaries within your sweat glands, which releases blood into your sweat, which causes your sweat, mostly in the facial region, to be tinged with blood. It's red. The other thing about hemodosis is it makes the skin extraordinarily sensitive, which sets him up for the flogging. See, just like almost no one questions that Jesus was crucified, almost no one would question that he was flogged. This is what you do to people before you crucify them. Flogging consisted, just to be clear, because remember, the question we're asking is, did he die or did he swoon? Flogging consisted of a whip. From the whip were these leather braids. At the end of the braids were pieces of broken bone and chunks of metal. Now, this wasn't like the whip that you would get like a buddy in the gym room with a towel. This was a bunch of pieces of leather with things designed to tear. The law said 39 lashes was the limit of what you could experience. Many people died in flogging, but it wasn't one of these. It was a landing in. They would strip the victim down from the shoulders all the way down to the back of the heels. That was what was fair game. And the idea was you landed it like a fishing lure into the victim's back, and then you pulled like a curtain. Whip, pull, whip, pull. You can see why many people died in this stage. One 3rd century Roman historian said it this way. Go ahead to the next slide. In describing the flogging, said the sufferer's veins were laid bare, and the very muscles, sinews, and bowels of the victim were open to exposure. Now, if you survived this, which would have been a 50-50-ish, you would have inevitably went through something called hypovolemic shock. Now, hypovolemic shock, hypo means low. Vol means volume, of course, and emic means blood. Hypovolemic shock is what your body does when it's bleeding to death or losing a huge volume of blood. The first symptom of that is your heart begins to race because it's trying to pump blood that isn't there. The next thing that happens is you become faint. So again, as we ask the story of are these gospel accounts fantastical or are they made up, you're reminded that Jesus experienced what people who got flogged experienced. He needed help getting the cross member to the cross. Why? Well, because he was going through hypovolemic shock, they would say. He's bleeding to death. That's why the Romans often arranged for people to help them get there. The third thing is you become extraordinarily thirsty. which it seems one of the few mercies the Romans offered in the crucifixion process, was a sponge at the cross dipped in some wine-drugged numbing mixture, because the victim of crucifixion was repeatedly crying out for his last mercy to be something to drink, because there's a loss of blood. And so Jesus, he arrives at the place of crucifixion. Now, what does crucifixion involve? Now, again, I'm not trying to make you feel sorry for him so you convert. I'm just trying to ask the question, are the accounts historical? Remember, when you talk about crucifixion, one way to think of it is it's like the Romans held a contest to go, what's the most brutal way of torture and killing that we could come up with? What's the best billboard we could raise? They didn't have graphic artists, they had crosses. What can we do to say to everybody around, don't mess with our authority? It's like they had a contest and crucifixion won. So they would first lay the victim down on the ground. The cross, the vertical member was permanent. They would have built these outside of cities. The victim would often bring the horizontal member. That would be laid on the ground. The victim would be laid arms outstretched on top of it. And the first thing they would do is extend each arm 6 inches beyond what was natural. The whole system was predicated upon the crucified victim being dislocated in both shoulders. After they were dislocated and their arms extended, 4 to 6 inch nails would have been pounded through their wrists. Now, some of you Bible purists are going, wait, the Bible says hands. Greek word's the same word. They'd have been nailed into this board. Medical examiners say that part of what that would have accomplished is invariably that nail would have went through one of the major nerves going into the hand, which some describe would be the equivalent of grabbing the nerve that we know as our funny bone and just reefing on it with a set of pliers. So the victim is now nailed to this cross member. It's hung on the vertical beam. One of the things that I think is interesting is there's very little historical support for this idea of these crosses who were 30 feet off the ground. You can see that'd be pretty unpractical. They didn't necessarily have a lift-all that they could just put the guy on. In many cases, you were looking at a sufferer eye to eye. Some would say that Jesus, it wasn't this looking down at Mary, it wasn't looking down at John, going, John, your mother. It's this eyeball-to-eyeball interaction. All that was required was that the feet not be able to touch the ground. They needed to be nailed into the vertical member, and that's when death started to happen. Now, the question becomes, how did a crucified, again, historically speaking, how did someone die? Well, they died of slow asphyxiation. You would suffocate under your body's own weight. The word excruciating, the etymology of the word, it literally means of the cross. See, it means, it's like the Romans, they'd come up with this system, and then it was so dark and so brutal that they didn't have a category for that kind of pain. And so they went, what do we call this? They had to make up a word to describe what a victim went through. What happened is your body was suspended by your hands, propped up by your feet, and your chest cavity was in the fully inhaled position. Just take a deep breath. The pressure created on your diaphragm required that your chest stay that way. So to take a breath, you pushed down on your feet, pushing up on your chest, relieving some pressure, allowing you to exhale. Needless to say, that hurt, because you're also driving those nails into your metatarsals, and then you would drop back down. Now you take a guess, how many breaths are you going to take? And of course, as your breathing slowed, your oxygen content of your blood depleted, the acidity raised, your heart further raced, and ultimately a crucifixion victim died of cardiac arrest, a massive heart attack. And so when we read Jesus saying, hey, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit, it wasn't an altogether unique experience. Victims knew when it was about to happen in many cases. This is also, by the way, why when they wanted to expedite the process, they broke the victim's legs. That would prevent the ability to take the pressure off your chest, and thus things would happen all the more rapidly. Now remember, the question we're asking is, did he die? The Quran, written in the 7th century, said he didn't. It says he swooned. There's a place in India where you can go celebrate his supposed actual burial place, because some have been saying and continue to say that Jesus, when he was placed into the tomb, the cool, damp conditions of that somehow revived him, and he walked away and continued to teach for decades. There's the evidence, there's what we needed to say, and there's our faith. Because remember, his claim was that he defeated death. And one of the questions you have to ask is, could a guy in that physical condition walk up to a reluctant Peter who had already given up on the movement and go, good news, I won? It's a tricky question. Now, if you did in fact die, the next question becomes, was the tomb really empty? Like, did his body really go missing? And of course, you're one step ahead of me, because what's to say that the disciples didn't just, throw his body in a bag and some rocks and throw it into the Galilee? Seems plausible. And there's a couple things when you want to go like, what's the historical evidence? There's a couple things that historians turn to. One is a guy that we meet up with in John, a guy named Josephus, who seems an unlikely candidate for what's to follow. It says later, Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body of Jesus. Now, Joseph was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly because he feared the Jewish leaders. He was a part of the Jewish Sanhedrin. That was this group of 70 guys who controlled the area. It's kind of like saying you're a part of the state Senate or something, or the Kiwanis Club, or whatever you prefer. He was accompanied by Nicodemus, the man who earlier had visited Jesus at night. Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloe, about 75 pounds. Taking Jesus' body, the two of them wrapped it with spices and strips of linen, then in accordance with Jewish burial customs. At the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid. Now, if he was buried in a tomb, admittedly, that would have been rare. Many times victims were left on the cross and eaten at by birds, and eventually the family may have been given the privilege of burying them if they had the resources for a tomb and an ossuary and all those different cultural things. But what historians point out is it seems weird that if the story was made up, you would make up a story about a guy who you could name, who was a part of a club that had a registry, that you could go back and go, hey, this Joseph of Arimathea guy, have you ever heard of him? No, never heard of him. Okay, toast. See, many historians, even those who don't follow Jesus, would go, it seems Joseph is the real deal, and the burial in the tomb actually happened, which leads to the question of why did the body go missing? Which leads us to, according to the Gospels, a story about these Roman guards. See, Matthew tells us that the Jews already were nervous. They were nervous about this idea that the disciples would come steal the body and somehow say something had happened. And so they arranged with Pilate for a guard. It says the next day, the one after preparation day, the chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate. Sir, they said, we remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver said, after 3 days, I'll rise again. So give the order, which is interesting because it means that his critics understood what he was saying more than did his followers. So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the third day. Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he's been raised from the dead, and this last deception will be worse than the first. To which Pilate said, okay. Like, take a guard. Go and make the tomb as secure as you know how. And so they went and made the tomb secure by putting the seal on the stone and posting the guard. Now the question is, was it empty? And was there a guard there? And think of this. Like, if there was a guard there, wouldn't the interaction have went like this? And this is the way the scriptures tell it. The Christians, Jesus is risen. The skeptics, no, he's not. You stole the body. No, we couldn't steal the body. There was a guard there. No, but the guard, like, they fell asleep. No, they didn't fall asleep. You bribed them to say they fell asleep. Like, that's what you would expect if that was actually happened, right? Like, some arranged it this way, some arranged it this way. That would have been the way it would have went. But if there was no guard, wouldn't it have sounded more like this? Hey, Jesus is risen. No, he's not. You stole the body. No, we didn't steal the body. The guards would have prevented us stealing the body. What guards? You're crazy. See, like even history would say if he wasn't risen the way we believe, it seems that the body did go missing. The other interesting thing is the first witnesses to the empty tomb were women. And if you were going to make up a story in this day about this resurrection thing, to say that women were your witnesses, like, hey, I called to the stand a woman, wouldn't have worked. No offense, ladies. But in a civil suit of this day, women could not testify. If they witnessed a murder, didn't matter. You weren't going to have a witness testify against you if you committed it. Their testimony didn't count. And yet the idea is that if the tomb wasn't empty for the reasons that the Christ followers claimed, then what we're saying is they made up a story about the enemy, a guy named Joseph, who they hated each other, who did the right thing while they were all cowering for fear. And then they made up a story about how women were the first one to see it. Sometimes the weirdness of it makes it seem like a little more accurate. In 1972, fast forward a couple decades, the U.S. government did something called deregulation of the airline industry. How many of you remember that? Deregulation means that they stopped controlling the prices and who could compete in what areas of the country. And in 1972, there were two airlines, both who had a very similar, in fact, almost precisely similar business paradigm. One was called Pacific Southwest Airlines, the other called Southwest Airlines. Pacific Southwest Airlines was first to market. They came up with these ideas that we all know as Southwest Airlines today, but it started with them. And in fact, Southwest Airlines learned it all from Pacific Southwest because regulation allowed them to go steal their ideas because they couldn't compete against each other. Anyway, 1972, both airlines had a history of being successful. The government deregulated the airline industry. Pacific Southwest Airlines said, we're toast. There's the facts. Pacific Southwest Airlines said, there's no way we can do business in this market. We're done. And so they sold the U.S. Airways, which eventually, like most airlines, lost heaps of money and filed bankruptcy. Southwest Airlines, taking the same set of facts, the same bit of evidence, they arranged it in a different way, and they said, we'll be fine. We'll be fine. And you may have heard a commercial, ding, now you're free to move out of the country. Like, who won? In fact, in 1972, if you would have invested $10,000 in Southwest Airlines, 30 years later, in 2002, that $10,000 was worth $12 million. According to the S&P 500, there literally wasn't a better business in the S&P 500 to invest in than Southwest Airlines. My point is simply this. There's the facts, and there's what we need them, want them, insist that they say, and there's a tension. And the question becomes, was there an appearance? Did this Jesus not just die and then go missing, but did he really show up again? Because remember, the claims aren't that he just went missing, but that he somehow appeared, that he showed up again, that he started talking to people. And to be fair, nobody saw him like walk out. There was no like mummified moment or whatever, however that worked, like when the stuff fall off and like how do you move the stone? Nobody knows. Nobody saw that stuff. But remember, we don't see dinosaurs. We study fossils. And we don't always know how a disease originates. We study symptoms. And so the symptoms that we have for the appearances, that they start in 1 Corinthians 15, in my view. 1 Corinthians 15, John was writing to this group of people called the Corinthians. He's writing about 20 years. The oldest dates for 1 Corinthians, or the newest, the latest it would be, is AD 52, seems to be the mostly unanimous opinion. John says this, for what I received, I passed on to you as first importance. Now, what he's saying there is what I'm about to write, I've plagiarized. Like I heard this song on the radio and I know I'm about to amaze you, but I didn't come up with the lyrics. What he's saying is there's a creed that's being passed around you long before I showed up. And here it is. For what I receive, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, that's Peter, and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James and to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also as to one abnormally born. 500 plus people. See, what you have here is a Jesus who, according to the Scriptures, sometimes made appearances indoors, sometimes out of doors. Sometimes to skeptics like Thomas, sometimes to close friends like John, sometimes to groups of people, sometimes to individuals. Sometimes they touched him, sometimes they had a meal together. This isn't this appearance thing of like, this isn't Patrick Swayze in the movie Ghost, or for those of you younger, this isn't Harry Potter and these people who were dead and these shadowy figures. The claims are a physical person who's like, ta-da, but boss, like, you're dead. I know, that's what's amazing. Let's have lunch. But will I like see it go through your digestive tract? No, I've got a body. That's the claim. And you go like, that's crazy. That doesn't happen. That's what they were saying. That doesn't happen. That's what got their attention. See, here's my point. You can say, here's the evidence. Here's the way I arrange it. Jesus did not appear in physical form. You can say that. But what you can't say is that the original church, that they didn't believe that's what happened. You take away the resurrection. Someone, N.T. Wright has pointed out, you remove the parts of the New Testament that deal with Jesus' birth, Christmas, you lose a couple chapters. You remove the parts of the New Testament that deal with Jesus' resurrection, you lose the entire New Testament. So you can say, I don't believe it. But what you can't say is the early church didn't claim not to have believed it, but to have seen it. You also have these gospel appearances, and I put them on the back of your mind map over and over and over again. And much like Joseph of Arimathea, what you have is this issue where they would have went like, hey, sir, they're saying, those Christians, that you saw it. Did you see it? Like you could have followed up on it. It's not like these accounts first appeared 300 years later. It's within years. Some date the creed that Paul just wrote here to 2 years after Jesus' resurrection. There's the facts. There's how we arrange them. And then there's the faith that drives our life. In fact, someone has pointed out that if you took every person in the Gospels who claims to have witnessed the risen Christ, and if you rented a court and you said, we're going to cross-examine every one of these witnesses for 15 minutes, if you started at bright and early in the morning on Monday, breakfast time, and you went continuously around the clock, you wouldn't finish up until around dinner on Friday. 129 hours of testimony. And remember, where they differ from me and where they differ from you is these aren't people who claim to have believed it. If Peter would have just went, sorry guys, that's a really bad joke. Could you take my wife off that cross now? That's all he had to do. Peter, the disciples, every one of them dying, what the early church went through. And again, this isn't persuasive per se. This is just like, these are facts. All they had to do was either produce a body or say, I was kidding. I didn't see him. Remove the knife from my throat. See, if you and I die for our faith, we die for something we believe. When the 500 plus died for their faith, it's not like a modern terrorist. They're dying for something they believe. They were dying for something they claim to have witnessed with their own eyes. It's categorically different. It doesn't make faith easy, but it's the facts. See, some of you, faith is this archaic, dusty, kind of mystical thing. And there's this sense of like, okay, there's so many faith claims. How in the world could this one be uniquely true? And that's why I go, would you just be willing to look at the history? There's more to it than that, but the history is a great place to start. And some of you, you're in the 7th round and one more punch to the gut and it's over for you. And listen, I get it. I get the tension of following a God who at times seems indifferent. I get the tension of the scandals. I get the tension of like, yeah, but look at me and my life and look at that kid in Hades' life. I get it. I'm not trying to simplify it. And you read the scriptures and you go like, really? Jonah and the whale and seriously? For me, and I guess what I'm inviting you into this morning is for me, the epicenter of the faith is Easter. It's Sunday morning. And unlike Jonah and unlike Genesis 1 and unlike lots of things in Scripture, there is incredible historical validity for the resurrection. Some would say the only way to explain a movement that was defeated, went back to work, decided fishing's going to be my career, turns out Jesus wasn't our governmental leader, Caesar's still on the throne. Some would say the only way to explain how these cowards became incredibly courageous was that Jesus was like, hey guys, I'm alive. And they're like, what? Why did he raise from the dead in a garden? Because the story started in a garden. And the story is, Jesus' claim is the chaos represented in the serpent. I'm going to deal with that. And no, it's never going to be perfect this side of death, but I'm putting things back to rights. Some of you have been toying with God. You've been teasing him with your life. And maybe just a little bit of like, oh, you mean to tell me that there's like some history to support this? Then maybe that's all you need to take a step of faith. Maybe Easter Sunday's the weekend you take it.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you. you'd like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.